You already know what you should be doing. That's not the problem. The problem is that something in you keeps choosing against it, quietly, consistently, without asking permission. You call it lack of discipline, but that's too shallow. What you're dealing with is attachment, not to pleasure, not even to comfort in the obvious sense, but to a version of yourself that you've repeated so many times, it now feels like identity. You don't return to comfort because it feels good. You return because it feels familiar. There's a difference. One is about sensation, the other is about structure, and your mind protects structure at all costs, even when that structure is built on things you say you hate. You say you hate wasting time, yet you repeat it. You say you hate being distracted, yet you allow it. You say you hate your current state, yet you maintain it. This contradiction isn't accidental, it's mechanical. Your mind is not designed to move toward what's better. It's designed to preserve what's known. That's why every time you try to change, something subtle interrupts you. Not a loud resistance, not a dramatic collapse, just a quiet shift, a small decision, a delay, a compromise that seems harmless in the moment. And that's enough, because the mind doesn't need to destroy your progress. It only needs to redirect your attention. Once your attention moves, your behavior follows. And once your behavior shifts, your identity remains untouched. That's the real objective, not improvement, stability. Even if that stability keeps you in a state you no longer respect, you think your problem is that you lack motivation, but motivation would only push you forward temporarily. What pulls you back is deeper than that. It's embedded in repetition. You've trained your mind to associate effort with tension, to associate discipline with pressure, and to associate comfort with relief. So when discomfort appears, your system doesn't evaluate it. It reacts automatically. You don't decide to stop, you drift. You don't consciously choose distraction, you default to it. And the more this pattern repeats, the less visible it becomes, until you start believing it's just who you are. But it isn't. It's what you've allowed to become normal, and normal is dangerous. Because once something feels normal, you stop questioning it, you stop observing it, you stop separating yourself from it, and that's when control disappears. Not suddenly, quietly. You begin to justify things you once rejected. You lower standards without noticing. You accept delays that used to bother you. And slowly, the version of you that wanted more becomes less active. Not because it died, but because it was ignored long enough to lose authority. Now something else is in control. Not a stronger version of you, not a disciplined one, just the most repeated one. That's what governs your actions, not your intentions, not your goals, your patterns. And your patterns don't care what you want. They care what you've proven. You've proven that when pressure increases, you step back. You've proven that when things become uncomfortable, you look for exit points. You've proven that you're willing to trade long-term direction for short-term ease. So your mind adjusts accordingly. It stops offering resistance to the wrong things and starts resisting the right ones. You feel it when you try to focus. There's a subtle push, not aggressive, just enough to create friction, enough to make distraction feel like a reasonable option. That's not weakness, that's conditioning. And conditioning doesn't respond to intention, it responds to interruption. But interruption requires awareness. And most of the time you're not aware when the shift happens. You only notice after it's already taken place, after the time is gone, after the focus is broken, after the decision is made. That's why you feel like you're losing control. Because you are. Not in a dramatic way, in a silent one. And silence is where these patterns grow, not in moments of failure, but in moments of inattention. When you stop watching yourself, your habits take over. Not the habits you say you want, the ones you've reinforced. So every time you think you're making a decision, you're often just following a script you've already written. You sit down to work, and within minutes, something pulls your attention away. You don't question it. You follow it, because that's what you've done before. And your mind doesn't distinguish between what helps you and what hurts you. It only tracks repetition. That's the system you're operating under. Not logic, not discipline, not willpower. Repetition. And repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort. and comfort becomes preference, even when it leads to outcomes you don't want. That's why you can feel dissatisfied and still choose the same actions, because satisfaction isn't the driver. Familiarity is. You don't move toward what fulfills you. You move toward what confirms you, and right now what confirms you is a pattern of avoidance, not extreme avoidance. Just enough to stay where you are. You don't quit everything. You just never go far enough. You don't collapse, you just plateau. And plateau feels safe, no risk, no exposure, no pressure to maintain something higher, just a controlled level of underperformance that you've learned to tolerate. That's your comfort zone. Not because it's comfortable in the emotional sense, but because it doesn't demand anything you haven't already proven you can handle. And your mind prefers that. It prefers known limitations over unknown potential, because potential introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty feels like threat, so it pulls you back, not violently, precisely. It waits until you start moving forward. Then it introduces doubt, not enough to stop you immediately, just enough to slow you down. Then it offers alternatives, distractions that seem justified, breaks that feel earned, delays that sound reasonable, and you accept them, because they don't look like failure. They look like choices, but they lead to the same place, back to the version of you that your mind has already memorized, and until that version is no longer reinforced, nothing changes. Not permanently. You keep thinking the problem is that you lose focus. It isn't. You never had control of it to begin with. What you call losing focus is just the moment you become aware of something that was already happening underneath your attention. The shift doesn't start when you notice it. It starts earlier, quietly, before you can label it. A slight resistance, a small hesitation, a thought that doesn't seem important, you ignore it, and that's where it takes hold. Because the mind doesn't need permission, it only needs space. And you give it that space every time you move without observing what moved you. You think you're choosing. But most of the time you're following the first impulse that doesn't create friction. Not the right one, the easier one. That's why you feel like you're being pulled back. You are. But not by something external, not by circumstances, not by lack of opportunity. You're being pulled by what you've trained yourself to accept without question. You've trained yourself to avoid pressure, not consciously, repeatedly. And now your system reacts to pressure as if it's a signal to withdraw, not a condition to move through. So when effort appears, something in you steps back, not dramatically. Just enough. You delay. You adjust. You tell yourself you'll return to it later, and later becomes the place where everything you avoid is stored. Nothing resolves there. It just accumulates, and the more it accumulates, the heavier it becomes. Not physically, internally. It changes how you approach the next attempt. You start with less clarity, less certainty, less control. Because now you're not just facing the task, you're facing everything you postponed. And your mind reads that weight as risk. So it protects you again. It reduces your exposure. It narrows your focus to something easier, something immediate, something that doesn't demand consistency. And you accept that trade, not because it's what you want, but because it removes tension in the moment. That's how the pattern sustains itself. Not through failure, through relief. Relief becomes your signal. Every time you move away from something difficult, you feel it. Subtle but present. A release, a drop in pressure. And your system records that, not as avoidance, as resolution. So the next time tension appears, your mind already knows the solution. Step back, delay, distract. And it does it faster, because repetition removes resistance. At some point, you don't even notice the decision anymore. It feels automatic, natural, as if there was no other option. That's when control is gone. Not because you can't act differently, but because you don't see the moment where action could change. You only see the result. You look at your day and wonder where it went. You look at your effort and wonder why it's inconsistent. You look at your position and wonder why it hasn't moved. But the answer is always earlier. In the moment you didn't observe. In the moment you let something pass without questioning it. That's where everything shifts. Not in the big decisions, not in the visible actions. In the small unexamined ones that repeat without interruption. You don't need more effort, you need interruption. Not of your environment, of your automatic responses. Because your environment isn't forcing you back, it's just presenting options. And your mind selects the ones that match your conditioning. So changing the environment won't solve it. Changing your reaction will. But that requires something most people avoid. Stillness. Not the kind that relaxes you, the kind that exposes you, where you sit without moving, without reacting, without following the first impulse, and you watch. Not casually, precisely. You notice the urge to check something, you don't act. You notice the thought that suggests delay. You don't follow it. You notice the discomfort building. You don't escape it. You stay. And that's where the conflict becomes visible. Because now the pattern doesn't run freely. It meets resistance, not external resistance, internal observation. And observation disrupts automation. At first it feels unnatural, forced, slow, because you're interrupting something that's been operating without interference for a long time. Your mind will try to move you again. It will suggest something else, something small, something harmless. But now you see it. And once you see it, you can't fully return to being unaware. That's the shift. Not a change in behavior, a change in perception. You start to recognize the exact point where you usually lose control, not after it happens, as it begins. And that gives you something you didn't have before. A moment, small, brief, but enough. Enough to decide differently, not easily, not comfortably, but deliberately. You don't need to force yourself into extreme discipline. That would collapse under pressure. You don't need to become someone else. That would create more resistance. You only need to stop moving blindly. Because once you remove blindness, patterns weaken. Not immediately, but consistently. The pull doesn't disappear. It becomes visible. And visibility reduces its power. You still feel the urge to step back, but now it doesn't feel like truth. It feels like habit. And habits can be broken not by intensity, by interruption, repeated interruption, until the old pattern no longer runs without being seen, until the version of you that was memorized starts to fade, and something else begins to take its place, not a better version, a more controlled one, not defined by what feels familiar, but by what is chosen.